Good morning. Today is July 17th, 2020. And today this session is going to cover inventorying your Raspberry Pi. So the first thing we're going to look at is the power outlet. And if you look on the label here, always read your label and see what the voltage is. So it'll, from the wall, this will receive 120 volts or 240 volts. In the United States, we use 120 volts, and in places like Europe, they use 240. And it also connects into the Raspberry Pi with a USB-C. Make sure you read this warning about the USB-C. You want to make sure your outlet is 120, because if you put too much electricity into your device, you're going to burn it up. So it reduces the 120 volts down to 5.1 volts, was what the Raspberry Pi needs. And also we have a nice feature with an on and off switch, also USB-C. So the next thing we're going to look at is a case. So we can see the case comes in three parts. We have the bottom part, and then we have the top, and also, the sides and the top. Next thing we have is a fan in our heat sinks, and the fan will pull the heat out of the Raspberry Pi by going in and top the cover. And these heat sinks dissipates heat from the important chipsets. So in this diagram, it tells you exactly where to put them, and we'll go over that in the next video. But the heat sinks are purposes to dissipate heat out of the Raspberry Pi, and there's also vents in here to help that. So you want to make sure your airflow is going out, so it's pulling air up and out. Make sure you take these blue stickers or this blue tape off before you put them on the chipsets. So the next thing we're going to look at is the heat sinks, right here again. And once again, make sure when you put metal on metal, you're going to have air pockets. And so what this thermal paste on here, you can see on the bottom of these, it's a white film. It's actual thermal paste. And then when it heats up, it puts, the heatsink covers all those little air pockets. And so you don't get a hot spot on your chipset. And a hot spot on your chipset will make the device shut down. So now we have the motherboard. And I will do this in the next video, but I have an anti-static mat. So I would put this on my wrist. If you don't have an anti-static mat and an anti-static wrist strap, then find a piece of rubber or a piece of plastic, maybe your cutting board that they have at the house is rubber or plastic. And so here is your motherboard. Try not to touch the pins or the metal components, especially on the bottom. Don't place this on the top of anything metal. Be careful. If you don't have the anti-static mat, make sure that you touch something metal before you start playing around with the Raspberry Pi to try to dissipate any static electricity. And so there's all these details and components on here we'll talk about, but this is all hardware. We physically can touch it. So hardware versus software. And so the software comes on an SD card, and there's a couple different ways you can, this is a USB stick. And then here's a different type. It's a larger SD to the micro SD. So either way, you can use either method you like, whatever you have. So on these SD cards is software. Now software controls the hardware. So all these things will not do anything until we get software so they can communicate with the hardware. So on here is pre-installed operating systems. So all we have to do is put this together, boot to this, which it automatically will, and then we can install the operating system. Also, if you have an anti-static bag, which your SD card came in, you can also use one of those to set that on. So the operating system on here is NOOBS, and that's what our Raspberry operating system is. Now there's three major operating systems: Microsoft Windows, Apple, and then Linux. And this is a Linux. The Raspberry Pi is built off the Linux kernel. It's an open source, where Microsoft and Apple, they're proprietary, which means you can't change their kernel or their code. Linux is an open source, which means there's a community of members around the world that actually contribute to the operating system and fix problems, and also fix the drivers and also patch security flaws. So we'll talk a lot about how cybersecurity goes into play when it comes to the Raspberry Pi when we get into more projects. So also in your kit, you got a Raspberry Pi camera and also an LCD screen. So we'll learn on the next video how to install the Raspberry Pi, boot it up, and get the operating system running. So that's the inventory of your Raspberry Pi, and that concludes the video.